What has been the most important modern advance in medical research? What will help us most to bring better health to Africa, to protect our children from disease? Could it be vaccinations, antibiotics, or even ARVs, the drugs used to treat HIV/AIDS? Or could the answer be less obvious?
Wow. What follows? Number?
Coming from a background of nursing and medical research, my answer will instead be the clinical trial, the method used everywhere to find out which treatments work and which do not. Almost every significant medical advance in the past 60 years has been tested and evaluated using randomized controlled clinical trials. Today, thousands of trials are in progress worldwide with possibly millions of volunteers. And now, this powerful tool is also being used in Africa. This is the story of a clinical trial which I helped to run called the FEAST trial. It was set up to help us save the lives of very sick children who arrive in hospital close to death. Five-year-old Achen Loy has just arrived at Soroti Hospital in eastern Uganda, 4 hours by truck from her village. The doctors suspect she has malaria or sepsis, a bacterial blood infection. There are very effective medicines which Achen is being given, but many children die in the first hours in hospital. So the question is, can the doctors keep her alive long enough for the medicines to take effect? Achen is already in a state of shock, a prelude to death. Shock is when the blood vessels start to lack fluids, so the body concentrates all available blood at the center where the vital organs are located, reducing the circulation to the limbs. Achen has a fever, but her legs and arms are cold, with a weak, rapid pulse. In wealthy countries, the first thing children in shock will be given is an emergency treatment called fluid resuscitation. Through an intravenous drip, they are quickly given one of several large doses of fluids called fluid boluses to try to restore circulation. But in wealthy countries, hospitals also have ventilators and other life support machines. Soroti Hospital, like most in Africa, does not have such equipment. So, would it be safe to use fluid resuscitation for Achen? It was to answer this question that the FEAST trial was set up. Worldwide, an estimated 2 million children die of malaria and septicemia each year. So if we could show that fluid resuscitation works in Africa, it will offer a simple and effective way of saving many, many lives. Fluid resuscitation has, for many conditions, been saving lives for a long time. It was first used for battlefield wounds where bleeding will quickly lead to shock. For burns and diseases like cholera or severe diarrhea, restoring lost fluids makes the difference between life and death. Over time, the treatment has been extended to other causes of shock, particularly for children. Their bodies work in different ways from adults. When they get high fevers from meningitis, malaria, or sepsis, children often develop symptoms of shock, even though they may not have lost fluids. Doctors found that fluid resuscitation could reverse these symptoms. Arms and legs will become warm again. Sometimes children in a coma will suddenly wake up.
Well, as a paediatrician in the UK, I'd witnessed many children whom I'd given fluid resuscitation to getting better. And so it was felt to be a very, very good thing.
12 years ago, Professor Kath Maitland moved to Kenya. There she saw many children coming into hospital in shock who will die in the first hours. She wanted to try giving fluid boluses as a supportive treatment, designed to buy time for definitive treatments like antibiotics or antimalarials to take effect.
In Africa, where infections are a very common cause of admission to hospital, very few children were receiving what we felt was the benefit of fluids, and this certainly had to be explored and, if not tested, in a clinical trial in Africa.
In fact, giving fluid boluses to children in shock had never been tested anywhere in a clinical trial, despite it being standard practice in the developed world. The reason was simple. A trial would involve giving boluses to some children, but not others, and then comparing the difference. So some children will be denied what was seen as a life-saving treatment. In Africa, however, the situation was different. Here, lack of resources has meant that fluid resuscitation is usually only given when children have lost fluids through injury or diarrhea. In Africa, it's not normally used in children in shock from malaria, septicemia, or other illnesses that cause high fever. Therefore, by enrolling these children into the trial, you'll not be denying them a treatment that they will normally get.
Sixth admission in the last year?
Even so, it took a long time to overcome objections and get the necessary funding and approvals which all clinical trials need.
The funders were not convinced because they really needed to see more evidence that A, that shock was common, and B, that you could safely apply fluid resuscitation. While we argued very strongly that fluid resuscitation was not a standard of care in Africa, there was some concern within the funding bodies that this is a new intervention, may bring harm, although it may bring benefit. And if you have to weigh up harm and benefit, then you have to discuss how you're going to protect your patients from the potential harm. And their view was that, could you really do this trial without the access to an intensive care unit?
To gather the evidence, the team in Kilifi did a series of observational studies. This involved giving fluid boluses and then carefully monitoring and recording all the clinical signs. The fluids appeared to reverse the shock. When funding finally came through, we needed to recruit a large number of children. So we teamed up with busy rural hospitals in Uganda and Tanzania. It was important to find out if fluid resuscitation could be used safely in real emergency rooms, not just research centers. We started with intensive training of all members of the acute pediatric teams. One way to make sure all children benefit from taking part in a clinical trial is to improve the general care as much as possible.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Capillary fill time is 3 seconds.
This is training in emergency triage and treatment, or ETAT. It teaches staff to recognize the signs of shock and give immediate priority to very sick children. These are skills learned through practice, which require people to work as a team. The results were dramatic, reducing mortality at all the hospitals. It also prepared staff to recruit for the study.
It was a trial in children who were critically ill, so there was a need for the staff to be able to identify these children who were eligible for the trial. So without training, they would not been in a position to pick out these children timely and enroll them to the trial.
Over 2 years, we recruited more than 3,000 children with shock caused by common diseases that produce fevers. It is important to say that children with gastroenteritis, diarrhea, trauma or burns who need extra fluids were not included in the trial. Recruitment itself posed unique problems. Normally, clinical trials need to get written informed consent from parents before enrolling a child. But in an emergency, this is not always possible.
Many times a mother with a convulsing child is not able to speak for herself. She will just be more concerned about the safety of her child than what you have to tell her. In
Kampala, Uganda, it was Mariam's job to explain the trial to parents, making sure they understood that children who do not join will still get proper treatment. In FIST, because of the pressure of time, the staff can get consent verbally first and only sign afterwards. This was approved by ethics committees both in Africa and the UK.
The consenting issue was a process. You started it when the parent arrived, but you went through it again and again and again and again as you saw the need come up.
After recruitment, the children are randomly divided into 3 groups or arms. A sealed envelope is opened to see which group a child will join. This is completely by chance through a computer program.
It is vital for this randomization to really be random. Otherwise, other differences between groups that the researchers are not aware of may creep in, and this will affect the results of the study.
In FIST, 2 groups of children are immediately given an emergency fluid bolus, 1 saline, 1 albumin. The third group or control group are given fluids more slowly at the amounts needed to maintain normal levels or maintenance fluids. Most parents want their children to receive the boluses.
They would ask, you said you were going to give us fluids. Where are the fluids you're giving us? Because you had not put up anything for them, so they would wonder. And especially if you recruited them with another patient at the same time and they were randomized to fluid and this one was randomized to no bolus. So they would ask, how come they have fluids and we don't have? So you'd have to go through the randomization process with them and explain to them that, well, not all the children in the study receive fluids.
After randomization, participants get the best treatment available. Blood samples are taken to reach a diagnosis. If required, they are given oxygen, antimalarials, antibiotics, or a blood transfusion. All treatments and vital signs have to be carefully recorded over the next 48 hours at intervals laid down by the child plan or protocol. This close control allows researchers to be sure that the only difference between the groups is the fluid boluses, the treatment the trial is designed to test.
The main outcome that we're interested in, and which we called our endpoint, was to ascertain the number of children who survived within the first 48 hours of admission. We also followed all the children a month later to ascertain if there were any deaths after discharge, and also to look for any long-term side effects that could possibly be due to the disease or the fluids that were given.
For the staff, monitoring everything that happens to the children at the correct times requires constant vigilance.
When I applied for FIST, I didn't know the extent of the work we were going to do, and it was a roller coaster ride. There was so much to do, so much writing, so much to document, and everything had to be done according to the protocol. So you are always catching someone like, oh, have you done this? Have you taken the blood pressure? Have you done this? You need to do this at the exact hour, and yeah, so many things to remember. But it has been a good thing.
As the information is gathered, Mariam has to check it. She needs to question anything that appears wrong or out of place. Special data monitors also visit periodically to help her and ensure all the sites are doing the same thing. Because doing a fluids trial was controversial, we monitored very intensively.
These 2 cabinets are full of data that we've been able to collect in the FIST trial. And mark you, this is just a 10 of the total data that we've been able to collect in the 6 trial sites. We have been able to go through this documentation 3 and sometimes up to 4 times just to make sure that the data we have collected is complete, it is accurate. And this is not within the normal monitoring procedures, but why we did this intense monitoring is because we understood the importance of the FIST trial questions and that we needed to make sure that the data is accurate. Laboratory findings.
As the trial progresses, Mariam does not know the results, but she can form an impression. Whilst checking data, she doesn't see much impact. But on the ward, she has seen some children given boluses recover quickly.
When a child received the bolus, usually they began to amend faster. By the 4th hour, they are much better in terms of their appearance. But those who didn't get their bolus and they really needed it, you would see how they struggle. There are children that you know in your heart that if they did not get that bolus, you're not sure if they would have survived.
Mariam is seeing what countless others have observed. Indeed, doctors visiting Uganda are incredulous that they should be doing a trial to test a treatment which is so widely used in the developed world. One specialist from the United States tried to intervene to give a child more fluids more quickly.
So he stands up and puts the drip running. He wants to increase the distance so that the drip would run faster. It was literally squeezing the fluid into this child. So when I told him we're doing a fluid trial in the acute care unit, he laughed. He was shocked. He said, "You don't need to do this. We already know the answer. Fluid is good." He said, everywhere it is done. In the US, it is done. In the UK, it is done. In Australia, it is done. In the developed countries. He was so convinced about it, I didn't think it was necessary for us to do a trial. We thought we were backwards.
As the data is collected, the forms are sent to the coordinating center in Kilifi to be put into computers. In many treatment trials, neither doctors nor patients know who receives which treatment to eliminate potential bias. Obviously, this is impossible in FEAST because everyone sees which children receive fluids. But during the trial, none of us, not even the senior researchers, have access to the computerized data. The only ones who do are statisticians at the Medical Research Council Clinical Trials Unit in London. At regular intervals, they produce interim analysis of the data.
Hi, Christina.
At first, this is inconclusive. Only as the number of participants increases does a clearer picture emerge. It's an enormous surprise. Far from being beneficial, they see that the children receiving fluid resuscitation are at a greater risk of death.
The results show that 89.4% of children who received boluses survived the first 48 hours in hospital. However, children who didn't receive boluses but were given fluid more slowly did better. 92.7% of them survived. This difference is significant. It means if we give boluses to all African children with shock, as in the FEAST trial, between 3 and 4 in 100 would be expected to die as a result of the treatment.
After nearly 3,000 children have been enrolled, for the first time, the evidence clearly shows fluid boluses given quickly can cause harm. So it will now be unethical to continue to recruit more children.
All trials have a safety net. As the results become available, they are shared with a small committee of independent experts known as the Data Monitoring Committee. It's their job to make sure the trial is safe.
Unlike the researchers and doctors, this committee sees all the data, so they're in a position to decide if and when a trial should be stopped.
So we very carefully looked at the data, and our remit was very much two things. First of all, to ensure the safety of the trial participants, which was sort of our utmost priority, but also to ensure that we got a definitive answer from this trial. It's really important in trials of this magnitude that they come up with a definitive answer for the future care of critically ill children.
In January 2011, the committee held a conference call, the 6th such meeting since the start of the trial. Rob Heidemann joined the call from Malawi, where he works.
So we needed to be reassured that there was no way that this result would change if the trial continued. I think the decision was very easy in that the data was very clear. It was very surprising, and we spent a lot of time at the meeting reassuring ourselves that this wasn't in any way an artifact, that this was a true result. But it was very important for us as the safety committee to stop the trial at this point.
Straight after the meeting, they called Kath Maitland in Nairobi.
I got a phone call telling me that they were going to stop the FEAST trial, and I thought we'd achieved the result that we'd been waiting for 10 years to achieve, that fluid boluses were going to save lives. But they told me that fluid boluses could not save lives. of children with severe febrile illnesses in Africa. This was, for me, absolutely devastating. It was not what we were expecting.
At this time, I was a trial manager for FEAST, based in Kilifi. Kath called me from Nairobi. She told us to suspend the trial and stop recruiting any more participants until further notice. She was very upset and had been in tears. We were all confused. Was this the end of 10 years of work and of our hopes of bringing a new treatment to Africa? Had we done the trial badly? Had we caused children to die? All these questions went through our mind.
My first concern was obviously that we'd done a trial which exposed children to an intervention that they might not have received in the absence of that trial. But having then looked more in detail at the data, one realised how profound the results were going to be, because not only did the mortality of the whole group was much better than that we'd previously projected, but we'd actually demonstrated something that had never been expected.
The results surprised me. This is because I saw a couple of children improving after getting big amounts of fluids. But I was more surprised because the results were against the current recommendations by WHO and against what is the normal practice in the wealthy countries, and this surprised me absolutely.
Most important, the trial had saved lives. In all the hospitals, there was a reduction in the number of deaths, even among those given boluses. It's strong evidence that simple measures, training, and close monitoring of sick children produced dramatic results. The trial was also well carried out. The trial plan or protocol was followed closely, and almost none of the participants left the study.
The study was conducted to a very high standard. It has achieved a level of adherence to the protocol and a level of retention I haven't seen in my 25 years of working in clinical trials. And for all these reasons, I believe that the results coming from FEAST are reliable.
Children living around the sites are exposed to a wide range of illnesses and conditions, including malaria, sepsis, pneumonia, meningitis, and acute anemia. This allowed us to look in much more detail what was happening. But in all these groups, the results pointed the same way. We also looked at children whose symptoms fitted different definitions of shock. Some had only 1 or 2 signs of shock. Others fitted the strict WHO definition. The more serious the shock and the sicker the child, the greater the risk posed by giving rapid boluses. And it made no difference the type of fluid, whether saline or albumin. Four months after the trial was stopped, all the teams got together in Soroti, Uganda, to be told the result. Until then, only a few of us knew, and we were sworn to secrecy. The scientific paper was now ready for publication. The researchers were quite sure what they had found.
We've examined the data very carefully, and we can find no single subgroup in whom fluid boluses are of any benefit. We're therefore going to recommend to the WHO and other policymakers that fluids given by a drip should only be given slowly, and to replace that would normally be drunk by a critically sick child.
But with time we realized it was good for.
Before the presentation, I asked nurses and doctors to try to predict what the result will be. Which treatment was better? So do you think the bolus worked or didn't work?
We really believe it worked so much. Because they were dying patients and they were saved.
We had our FEAST patient who was brought in a moribund state, and after the initial bolus, the girl got up and asked for a drink. So by that, it made us feel that fluids are actually very important, and it's good that we administer them rapidly.
Yeah, going by what I've read and what I've experienced in treating some of the children that gave boluses, I think some of them benefited.
Yeah, according to how I've been observing the children whom we've been treating, they've actually been coming up after giving the boluses.
Based on observations, kids who received boluses actually improved quickly. So I think boluses really help in the immediate outcome.
Those who had no boluses did better than children who had a bolus.
After 2 years of working together, we all knew each other quite well. I really felt for the trial teams when Kath told them the results.
So boluses were not saving lives. Boluses were harmful.
You could see what was going through their minds.
Does that surprise you? It was a surprise to me.
So how does one explain the fact that most people working on the trial predicted a different result? Did we really see children getting better? How did we miss the risk posed by fluid resuscitation?
The FEAST results demonstrate very clearly that doctors and nurses cannot know what to do just by observing. It is only through a randomized controlled clinical trial with large numbers of participants that researchers can pick out what is really happening, the underlying trends. It is this which makes clinical trials such a powerful tool for us to learn.
So it was written today? It was yesterday. 12 weeks after the trial was stopped, the scientific paper was submitted to the New England Journal of Medicine, where it was published in May 2011. We all had to work very hard for such a tight deadline, but we wanted to get the news out. The paper received worldwide interest, giving a boost for research in Africa.
The high quality of data that we have got and high success recruitment rates have shown us that it is possible to do research in Africa. The other thing that I can see coming out of FEAST is that not every recommendation that is coming from the West or elsewhere is applicable in Africa. So we need to do research in Africa for Africans.
I mean, I think this is a landmark trial for a number of different reasons. First of all, because it was conducted so well and so rigorously, so it demonstrated that such trials can be done in really very difficult circumstances to a very, very high standard. I think that it also changed people's perception of how critically ill children should be treated, both in a resource poor setting, but also brings into question how we treat people in industrialised countries such as the UK or Europe or the US.
Since the FEAST trial was started within Africa, there has been more widespread use of intravenous fluids, boluses, which is encouraged by the WHO guidelines. The WHO guidelines encourages aggressive management of shock. Usually it's encouraged that the child receive fluids in boluses, 20 milliliters per kilo, as fast as possible. And this can be repeated up to 3 or 4 times within 1 hour. In practice, I would like you to imagine a typical 4-year-old who weighs about 16 kilos. This would mean that the child is receiving about 1 liter of fluids. You're actually almost replacing the whole amount of blood that they have. You are talking about 5 glasses of fluid. But you imagine that this is being given intravenously and very fast. So you're giving a lot of fluids to these children within a very short duration of time.
But the public message also needed to be carefully worked out. Water is, of course, the source of life. It will be disastrous if people got the wrong message that fluids are bad. All sick children who cannot drink for themselves need an intravenous drip to stay alive. And many conditions where fluids have been lost were not covered in FEAST.
It means that children who present with diarrhea, gastroenteritis, will still need big amounts of fluids. This group we did not study in FEAST. Children who present with shock and conditions similar to the FEAST patients, such as severe malaria and sepsis, will only need maintenance fluids.
But how about the rest of the world, particularly wealthy countries where fluid resuscitation is normal practice? Will the results of FEAST apply?
The FEAST trial results challenge our understanding of emergency fluids for children with shock. And paediatric emergency guidelines worldwide are going to have to reassess their recommendations for giving boluses. Having said that, boluses in wealthy countries may not carry the same risk because children are healthier and they also have access to intensive care facilities and ventilation. They may also have a different range of illnesses. What is completely clear is we're going to have to do more research.
The trial result sets the scene for further important landmark trials to be conducted in this way. And there are a whole cohort of children that weren't recruited into the trial where these sort of questions still need to be addressed, particularly in relation to the treatment of severe diarrhoea and the management of fluid resuscitation in malnourished children. So all of these questions will need to be addressed.
The need for more research was highlighted by an incident which has haunted the principal investigator in Kampala, Bob Opoka, since it happened. Before publication, while still sworn to secrecy, he saw a visiting intensive care specialist from the United States give fluid resuscitation to a very sick child in shock from diarrhea, a condition not covered by FIST. With no intensive care unit, he thought the treatment was risky, but he did not feel he could intervene because the doctor was not going against current guidelines.
She was surrounded by students asking her, so how many times can you give? This bolus said, oh, as long as the patient is in shock, you give more. And so she was saying, give more. And they went on up to about 6 boluses. And the parameters changed a bit. The pulse was slightly better. She was looking on with triumph that, yes, I've saved this child. And she walks out. As she walks out, just after passing the door, the patient gets a massive pulmonary edema and dies. And I was there. I almost felt like I contributed to the death of this child because I knew from our results that boluses are not probably good for children. But the guidelines says the contrary. So it's very important that we get this into policy as soon as possible because without it, many more children will continue to die.
I think it's been shocking how long it has taken the world to respond to the FEAST study, and I think particularly looking towards the WHO as a norm-setting organization, that they really need to react to this new evidence. We were working on our guidelines and we decided to do a systematic review. That was a real eye-opener for me in particular because I had understood and believed naively, I guess, that the orthodoxy that I had been taught as a young physician to give fluids to all children in shock, regardless of the cause of shock, was based on strong evidence. And I kept expecting there to be that study that we just couldn't find yet that would show us that, in fact, there was some evidence that our beliefs were based on in terms of treating severely ill children with shock. In fact, we never did come up with that study because, of course, it doesn't exist. The FEAST is the best evidence that we have for this group of children. So we've convened a group of experts to help us figure out how to change and adapt our guidelines. So what we've done now is we've designed an algorithm that helps the nurse or the doctor at the field level decide which children are going to benefit from bolus therapy and which ones are not.
Even after a trial as big and well conducted as FIST, it takes a lot to convince the medical world that guidelines and practice need to be changed. Since the FIST trial was published, I've had comments from colleagues and read many opinions from doctors and nurses who find it hard to believe. It all appears to contradict what they've seen at the bedside. There were multiple objections. Had we given boluses to children who did not really need them? Had we made some conditions like severe pneumonia worse by giving fluids?
1 hour, we were able to say, well, everybody had shock when they came in. Let's look at what happens at an hour. And by 1 hour, nearly 50% of the children who'd received boluses, their shock had resolved. So that's actually what you see at the bedside.
After publication, Kath Maitland continued to keep the trial team informed as more data was analyzed. Case by case, they looked at all the children who had died. They found that the more severe the illness, the greater the risks of giving a bolus. But the children did not get the symptoms of an overdose of fluids. Their lungs did not fill up, nor did their kidneys fail. On the contrary, they initially got better, but then went back into more severe shock and died.
Well, the analysis of the data showed, rather like we had seen at the bedside, that children at 1 hour after their boluses, their shock had improved. There's even a large number of children who actually woke up. So we felt that we weren't wrong, but what subsequently happened is that did not translate to a survival benefit. In fact, children in the bolus arms were much more likely to develop catastrophic shock in the hours following this. And this is one of the reasons why you have to do a clinical trial.
FIST was able to tell us how best to help children like 5-year-old Achen Loy in Soroti. She came to the hospital just after the end of the trial, so the staff by now knew not to give her a fluid bolus. However, what the trial could not do was to tell us why. Could it be that the chemical makeup of the fluid itself causes damage? Could it be that boluses are just given too quickly? Or might shock actually be a natural defense mechanism which is helping Achen to cling onto life for a little longer? If that were found to be the case, it will lead to a complete rethink of our whole understanding of what happens to our bodies as we get close to death. Achen spent 2 days in the emergency room at Soroti Hospital. She was given antibiotics, antimalarials, and blood transfusions for acute anemia. As she slipped in and out of consciousness, 2 other very sick children died on the table next to her. But eventually, she recovered. Today, Achen is back in her village with hope restored of leading a healthy life. FIST showed which treatment was best for her. But like most good research, the trial also threw up new questions which we need urgently to answer. And how will we do that? In the only way we can, by designing new clinical trials.
Ada